I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that when we try to as the LGBT movement, right? We have always been trying to actively, there has been attempts, especially trying to negotiate with the state and just basically having the concession of just trying to live, trying to have civil rights, trying to engage in the society. I think these attempts has always been a lost cause. And in a lot of instances, right, we think because of these reasons, and I'm going to elaborate to you more later, why we need to actively undermine we need to actively undermine the idea of trying to reconcile religion and basically trying to have the LGBT movement trying to have states understand this, right? So what does it look like when a few pieces in setup, right? First is that we understand that we want to campaign actively to exclude the idea of reconciling religion with in the policies in the public sphere. So it looks for example, that we need to call as the LGBT movement, you want to call out and stop supporting the idea of gay conversion therapy. You want to stop the ideas in which that you there is criminalization of moral crimes, for example, trying to label what are the things that are unnatural sex and things like that. We think in these ideas, right, there has always been an attempt, especially on the state, to try to create policies, especially with how religion is embedded into the policies of the states, because we think in a lot of instances there are still conservatives. Because this debate has to operate in a world in which that maybe there is a chance for the LGBT movement to succeed. But the problem is also because of the idea that we also have ultra conservatives. We still have conservative values and policies, and we think and we're going to explain to you later. Even when these do not exist, it still means that we still want the movement to not reconcile religion with the causes, right? So few things, right? OG here doesn't have to prove that we need, when you try to undermine it, it doesn't have to be completely successful. As long as there is progress, we think that's enough. We think that as long as the LGBT movement doesn't try to reconcile religion in some way, we think that's enough. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to it doesn't mean that the moment you want to abolish for the reconciling of religion, it means that you want to the goal can only be attended when the policies, all of the policies are taken down, right? So few comparatives, right? We think that, so a few things that also and just preempting it, right? We think that the moment in which we try to create some concession, right? First is that it's going to create it gives legitimacy to the oppressors, which are the state. We think in this idea, it means that you have a thin ceiling in which that the concession is that at the end of the day, the movement doesn't get to express themselves in such a way that they can actually that they have always been represented. For example, at the idea in which that we have always been an open movement, and that the we have always been an open movement to our sexuality on all of the ideas in which that we have always been principled based on. So the idea of being open to sexuality in itself, right? That's something that when you actually try to reconcile religion, it means that that the concession that that's going to happen is that it's going to take away one of the major the main characteristics of the movement itself, in which that we cannot be open. Therefore, for example, it looks like banning gay bars, banning pride parades. These are the things that you can't that side op has to defend at the end of the day, right? And so let's just go to my first argument. Firstly, understand that the attempt to reconcile has always been a futile idea. We think that it's a lost cause. So 2 layers of analysis here. First is that we understand that it's reliving the trauma that the state has always been implemented. For every attempt the movement tries to reconcile religion with their causes, what happens is that these attempts has always failed. The moment that you try to negotiate with them, right? These are people who are already oppressing you from the start. These are people that has actually always tried to create some has always tried to oppress you in such a way that, for example, the anti-discrimination laws cannot actually be operating or administered thoroughly, because the idea in which the state or like the people or like religion in general cannot accept their idea. And we're going to elaborate more on like my second argument, right? But the first is that it's always going to relive the trauma. The kid that has gone through gay conversion therapy always has to remember the fact that always has to remember that religion has tried to undermine their existence. I do think that's a preferable world to live in, right? But also, right, we think that when you try to like this, trying to reconcile with the religion, it means that you're appealing to the people that has always undermined you at the end of the day, and we think that we don't want that. So second layer, right, the state has always endorsed policies in order to like adopt this idea. It's a structural barrier. In order for you to undermine in order for you to like break that structure, it's something that is impossible. The barrier is so high. In which, for example, we look like how the state how because of religion that has always because of like religion-backed state policy. So like it's the creation of religion-backed state policies, for example, gay conversion therapy, in which that it was lobbied by ultra-conservative people. At the end of the day, these policies are still being implemented. The narrative that being gay is a mental illness is still being persuasive, even up to this day. So Side Out has to defend a world in which that the best concession is that these policies will still be implemented in some way. So second argument, right, on the moral standing as to like why we think like you shouldn't actually try to appeal to religion. First is I understand that there has always that in order for you to reconcile, you need to have some sort of legitimacy from scriptures, from doctrines, and that's something that is not available within all of like, for example, like the Abrahamic religions or like a lot of religions in general, right? We think that the moment that you actually try to do this, like basically it's not there if you don't get any form of legitimacy. Because the thing is that, and this is my second layer, right, it has always been prominent that the idea of being gay is morally wrong. You cannot reconcile this identity. You try to appeal to Pope Francis so many times, but even the best, even like the most lenient popes cannot accept the idea of like gay marriage being a thing. You cannot accept the idea of like, basically the movement doesn't have any moral credibility in religion. So even when reforms happens, there's a lot of like problem, especially internally for the movement in itself. So we think like on those ideas too, the movement doesn't have any more legitimacy to drive themselves apart. So these are the things that when you actually try to like reconcile religion with the causes of the LGBT movement, you don't actually get it. You don't try to appeal to the oppressor.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now call on the leader of opposition.
Hi, let me just set up my timer, yeah. I'll take my PY in chat, probably at the 5th minute by closing government, if not, then opening government.
Because they rely their premise, they rely their arguments, they rely on the premise of proving that they need to have some form of moral persuasion to persuade people to buy into their advocacy within status quo. So without their analysis, most of the benefits aside the previous speaker before me said, there has no foot in this debate. But before that, I have three argumentations, but before that, a few points of rebuttals. The first thing the speaker before me said, that they said they can get organic change because we can always have religious scholars to persuade people and have some form of subjective religious interpretations. The first thing I would say, when we talk about LGBT movement, there are fundamental interpretations of religion. That is to say that we always stone gaze and the scriptures are clear-cut, which means that you cannot have some form of moral persuasion to give legitimacy to say that we also need to accept people from the LGBT movement. But the second thing I would say, there is a ceiling to change if you try to reconcile religion and also being LGBT at the same time. Because every time when the LGBT movement wants to make some form of concession, always the religious movement will always push back towards you. And this is evident when my prime minister said that the evangelicals with the United States actively lobbied for the anti-discrimination to not let the LGBT movement to receive their cake. Or for example, back then, it was a branded thing that mental health, within the mental health option of like, solving the gays, for a lack of better word, it's branded. If you are gay, you are a you are having a disease or kind of thing. And this is a state endorsed thing, Madam Chair, and it's really, really bad. But the third thing I would say is that organic change, this is assuming the best case from opening opposition, has always occurred like internally. When if you're religious gay in a conservative setting, you've always created religious space within yourself within the private sphere. But in terms of public policy and the way we treat LGBT movement, it hasn't been externally. Public policies has always condemned the gays every time when the religious have any footing to decide the way in which we control people within the LGBT movement. The second thing the speaker before me said was that, these people, we cannot move. And it's sad if these people don't try to reconcile with their identity. The first thing I would say is that moral policing happens on both sides of the house, but it is not uncommon for people who are also religious and who also at the same time to be gay can't create religious spaces for themselves to create that safe space. People can go to Friday prayers at the same time when they go at night and like conduct their own LGBT activities or whatever. It's fine. People do that all the time. But the second thing I would say, presumably under your side, if you say that moral policing would happen worse on the outside of the house, it is more under your side of the house, considering that people would actively undermine you and moral police you all the time. Where, for example, if you're promiscuous to a certain extent, for example, if you act in a certain way that might have some form of marker for you to be an LGBT person, it does not change as well under your side of the house. Actively trying to adopt the language of a religious person means that you undermine the credibility of the LGBT movement. You always have to make concession that determines the likelihood of your identity of an LGBT person within status quo. And this is a moral thing, and this is a morally abhorrent thing for you to do as an LGBT movement, considering that the extent of trauma that you have to face, you need to justify your existence to the religious movement who already set in stone that the scriptures, they want to stone the gays. I'd rather take the high ground of not actively undermining them and say that we should not have any footing of religion within the public policy, as opposed to having some form of reconciliation process, which opening opposition didn't even bother to make it clear from the very beginning. 3 points of argumentation in my speech. Firstly, why trauma and just fair existence is a morally abhorrent thing. Secondly, why seeking to change, and lastly, why the LGBT movement has no moral legitimacy in the eyes of religion. I'll start with the last one first. Why LGBT movement has no moral legitimacy in the eyes of religion? The first thing, because we said that the scriptures are unlikely to change, and because it's like the word of God. Nobody wants to change the word of God. Like Jesus said things, the Tuhan also said things. Nobody wants to change those things. But the second thing we would say, it is unlikely for them to get moral persuasion to persuade religious scholars to portray a subjective interpretation of religion when the interpretation of religion is, number one, when you talk about LGBT people, is set in stone. You don't get moral legitimacy means that you don't have moral credibility to gain leverage of your concession. So what's likely to change under their side? So this is assuming the best case of opening opposition. So okay, perhaps you can be gay, but you can't have like gay pride parades, or you can't sexualize gay pride parades, or you can't show your sexuality, or we have to always moral police you. You can't go and be gay out at night and don't have gay clubs because it will damage the family structure of or within a certain country or within a certain community. And that's a bad thing, because if you're LGBT individual, your pride is the only thing that you have as a person. I'll accept for CEO, I won't accept from opening opposition because you have a chance. But the second thing I would say, that's the best case that opening opposition can get, because there's a ceiling to change in the way in which where you have when you make concessions with the religious people. But lastly, in like on a moral standing, it is unlikely for you to get any form of solace, the fact that you need to always justify your existence to the religious people, knowing that you have gone through gay conversion therapy as a state endorsed, and it's also a state endorsed thing, because it was a public policy, because we branded being gay as a mental health issue, because we branded that these people are warranted to be discriminated because they can't buy cakes, because they can't buy gay cakes who put like gay couple within those cakes. And that's so bad, because you can't buy cakes, right? And that's really bad, because you need to justify existence to these people on a daily basis. These individuals would never be persuaded to any form of arguments that you give them to the LGBT movement, because these people always say that, but my God says that we cannot provide these people, we cannot be friends with these people, and that is my God. Some like natural being that supposedly says this, there's something we have to follow, but when it comes to humanity, we actually don't care about these people. And this is a really, really bad thing. All of the things that opening opposition said, and this is really, really important in terms of framing, they've never proved their organic change and the way in which how they want to make their scriptures persuasive for people to buy into the fact that the people would want to accept gays. Devoid of that reasonings and premise and arguments, they cannot claim any and all of their benefits. So proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hi, I'll take POIs in chat, preferably from closing. Starting my speech. Oh, give me a second. Set up my timer. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chat, I think it's extremely convenient that site opening government comes up today and says that your scriptures cannot change, completely relying on the doctrine of Islam, completely ignoring the reformation of Christianity, and understanding that Islam is a much newer religion compared to Christianity, and perhaps their reformation just has not existed yet. Insofar as we tell you that religion is something that is subjective to individuals, and we've seen this within status quo, right? We've seen this within, like, progressive spheres within America, where women who identify as LGBT, who still opt into Islam, have alternative interpretations of the religion, like primarily engaging on the idea that religion is a bastion of peace, right? That as, like, if they want to talk about Islam, I'll talk about Islam, right? That religion is a religion, like that Islam is a religion of peace, and that is the forefront of the religion, and that is something that they want to talk about. I'm unsure as to why they are so convinced that religion is unable to change, given the fact that the same religion they are citing also, like, says that you should kill apostates. So I'm unsure why, you haven't killed enough apostates to tell me why this is something that is inherently problematic. Secondly, they say that they don't have to prove to us how they get change, but then they push the burden on us to prove change. And I feel like that's quite uncharitable, but we'll do it anyway, right? Firstly, I think on the idea that they can't prove change, they don't really mechanize it. They don't really analyze it outside of the idea that, if you push hard enough, at least you remove yourself from the religious movement, and this is something that is preferable. I'm unsure as to why that is necessarily true. If it's true, and this is the POI I wanted to ask OG, but they conveniently did not want to accept the POI. If it's true that OG wanted to say that they have an attempt, that the religion is embedded by the state, I'm unsure as to why religion will give you any concessions. I'm unsure as to why the state is ever going to change if you actively undermine them. I think at a point in time where someone slaps you in the face, you're going to want to slap them back. I'm unsure as to why you're going to shake hands with them and suddenly give them concessions. Secondly, even if it's true that those scriptures are something that is unchangeable, even if it's true that this indoctrination is so powerful that you cannot get anything under our side of the house, we tell you at the very least we benefit minority individuals. Recognize, panel, that religion is something that is sacred to individuals. Religion is something that by virtue of your community, by virtue of how you were raised, and by virtue of the people that you love, forms a part of your identity. At the point in time where you remove religion from the LGBT movement, you create a large gap between them, right? This means to say you're going to have a high likelihood that these individuals are going to be really, like, internally conflicted, right? Because you're either gay or you believe in your religion. The thing is, if it's true that your religion is something that is entirely sacred to you, if the LGBT movement forces you to choose between them, it is going to be worse off for these individuals. OG does not engage. But yeah, before that, I'll take CG's POI.
All right, I'm really confused as to which characterization of religion does OO want. LO comes out and says religions will mess anyone up who tries to come out as a gay individual, try to fight against them. But now you say religion can make change. Which one is it?
Yeah, you're great at straw manning first. But secondly, right, I think you have to understand that there are many ways that people approach religion. I think first, you generally have the ultra-conservative individuals who want to prosecute individuals because they want to remain in power. This is something that exists under both sides of the house. We posit to you that it's far worse under your side of the house at the point in time where you are unable to allow these individuals to have safe spaces. At the very least, you're forcing these individuals to have to choose. You either leave your religion or you identify as gay. We tell you to a large extent, at the very least, these individuals don't have to choose under our side of the house because you tell them that this is an alternative view you can take of your religion. You are still accepted even though you feel like religion is a strong part of your identity. And this is something that is mutually exclusive to our side of the house. The point in time where you want to actively demonize religion, this is not something you're ever going to get, right? You're never going to get buy-in because you're increasing the barrier of entry. People are always going to feel alienated. You're always going to alienate certain individuals. Next, engaging on the idea coming from OG that, you're going to negotiate with your oppressors. We think to a large extent it's not about negotiating with your oppressors, it's about finding a middle ground. We don't care if your oppressors are unhappy with the alternative interpretation, as long as we're able to ensure that individuals feel like it is something that they're able to access, it is something that they don't have to give up a part of their identity to. Recognized panel, the most important clash within the debate is about who better helps minority individuals who both still want to identify within their religion, because this doesn't affect anyone else, right? Individuals who are already gay, individuals who don't believe in religion, individuals who, even if they're actively demonized by religion but have opted out, are not part of the debate because they don't give a shit what the religion says. The comparative is, and the only place where we engage with both sides of the house is about minority individuals who feel like they don't want to give up their religious identity. And this is how we win the debate. Secondly, then, we wanted to talk about the future generation and how it's far better for these individuals, right? I think at the point in time where you already open an avenue for individuals to be able to talk about alternative interpretations of religion, even if it is not entirely accepted by the vast majority, we think that because religion is something that is deeply personal to individuals and something that individuals are able to like internalize, we tell you that it far reduces the conflict that exists within them, right? This means to say you're probably going to get more individuals in the future who maybe can push for reform. Well, okay, if like reform doesn't happen right now, we don't have to prove that. Like the comparative is the same under that side of the house. They don't explain how they're ever going to get change, considering you are actively demonizing religion probably going to crack down on you more. We tell you, at least under our side, you allow individuals to feel like they're accepted, to feel like they can reconcile the two conflicting parts of their identity, i.e. that you're gay and they're religious. We tell you this is a far more preferable world for the most amount of individuals on the outside of the house. Never been prouder to out.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now call on the member of government.
Hi, sorry, give me like 20 seconds. Hello, can you see me?
Yes, I can see and hear you clearly.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Shireen. It's quite dark, but it's fine. I'll take POIs in the chat, she, her, preferably from, yeah, anyone, don't mind. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. OO's entire premise is reliant on one single thing. They wanted to talk to you about how the reconciliation of the dual identity of a gay individual who is also religious is the most important thing in the debate. That was literally contingent upon the reconciliation being something positive. If Salleh's characterization was true, in that these conservative societies actively demonize actively demonize the act of being gay to begin with, and everything that they said previously in the LO speech was true, in that the capital within the society is directly against the gay community, I am unsure as to what that reconciliation of identity looks like. It is either you do reconcile religion as a gay person and can see that according to your religion being gay is bad, actively now conflicting your other identity, or you choose one. I'm not sure as to why they wouldn't push against us the idea that we have to reconcile these two identities. The premise that we give to you, these identities are not reconcilable. That is why we have to abandon it and preserve one. My first response is simply in terms of reframing. I don't care about theology. I don't care about what doctrine says. I agree with Salleh when he says, or when they say, sorry, that these doctrines are highly subjective and you can Google things and interpret things on your own will. The problem is the institution institution of religion as it manifests in society does not care about subjectivity. The institution of religion premised upon hierarchies and your imams and muftis literally gaining power by having influence over people and perpetuating doctrine is the thing that we have to oppose, because even if you as a person believe in the love thy neighbor rhetoric in the Bible, if your church still says that being gay is a sin, you can't fight back against it because you have no power in that regard. The first thing I want to talk about is responding to the dual identity argument coming out of the DLO speech. Their entire speech was premised on the idea that the reconciliation is going to be good. That somehow now that once the movement reconciles with the religious authority, all of a sudden you'll feel catharsis in your identity as a religious person who is also in the gay community. One, I'm unsure how that reconciliation is going to look like. I think they were very sort of optimistic when they talked about the reconciliation being something that is positive, in that all of a sudden your gay identity will be accepted by your fellow churchgoers or your fellow mosque goers. They had to prove to you, simply in the OO speech, which was flagged up by OG, why that reconciliation was true to begin with. The only response we got was doctrine is subjective. It is not subjective in the eyes of the institution, as I'll talk to you in my speech and complete the OG analysis on this. Let's first talk about the first premise about OO, in that religion is reconcilable with the LGBTQ movement. I think OG gives you a very simple premise in that there's doctrines that actively say that homosexuality is bad, and therefore they will just continue to recite those doctrines against them, but they do not recite necessarily why that incentive continues to exist. I'll take a point later on. The reason being the institution of religion is one that perpetuates these doctrines for the same idea as to why governments continue to want to hold their influence over people on the ground. Just quickly flag here, the second premise of the OO case is simply that once you actively antagonize religion, all of a sudden they'll crack down on you more. I'm unsure what the comparative is, considering that in status quo, these religious institutions already crack down on gay people. If you express yourselves like what Salleh said in Kelantan, for example, you protest, you're going to get jailed, which means the comparative is null and void, simply because backlash against these individuals exists symmetrically. Let's just talk about why the chance or probability of religious reconciliation in terms of the institution of religion is going to be not likely. The first reason is that the imams and muftis that Salleh wants to talk about literally gain influence and power by holding themselves over religious people. The reason being that these religious people on the ground feel as though these imams or muftis or priests, for example, are proponents of religion that convey God's word and actively teach people on the ground what God says, and therefore they look to them as like idols of religion that they can respect and seek solace in. That is why they have a good chunk of influence over these societies, and because they directly gain influence over their people, they have no incentive to want to suddenly reverse the ideas that people on the ground believe in. Sure, I can agree that priests can subjectively choose to tell people that love thy neighbor is a stronger moral doctrine than to stone homosexuals on the ground, but they have no active incentive to do so at a point in time in which the attempt at doing that is seen as sacrilege and actively losing faith in their own people on the ground. That is why reconciliation isn't likely to happen. It's not about what the doctrine says, it's about whether or not these people are willing to do it in the first place. If they believe that going against the religion is going to suddenly get them in the bad eyes of God because they never listened to the doctrine in the first place, they're not going to do it, even if it's a subjective thing, because also believing homosexuality is equally subjective. The next thing I want to talk about is very simply the idea of concessions, because also all try to frame the idea of concessions being a good thing because at least you get some sort of change. They never frame too specifically what these concessions look like, but I will do this in my speech because I don't think OLG impacted it either. The compromise is likely going to be in favor of the conservative majority because of the greater capital and political influence that Salleh and OO framed that in their speech as well. That means that the solutions resolving homosexuality or the sort of aids that are given to the LGBT community are likely going to be against their favor and in the favor of the religious community who do not feel like the gay community or the act of being part of the community itself is something that is good in society. This looks like promoting the idea of finding God or finding religion to cure your homosexuality. I don't think it's going to look like the ideas of funding gay shelters or funding pro-gay campaigns. The comparative that Salleh gave to you was true, in that protests on our side of the house, or expressions of gay creativity on our side of the house is likely going to be jailed or whatever. But I think that's equally likely on your side of the house at a point in time in which you reconcile, at the best case, with your religious authority. You still have to sort of abide by whatever they want to tell you, because if you don't, that's also when they're going to demonize you in return. This means that you can't have pro-gay campaigns, you can't have public expressions of your gay identity, which means if your side wants to talk about the reconciliation, I'm unsure how you necessarily get that when the identity of being gay on the other side is still demonized by your other identity as well. I'll take Salleh very quickly.
Shireen, what is the straw man? I said the state probably hates gay people, but they hate atheists who betray them more, right? So you need to undermine these people. We just need to discuss things with them, right? You need to engage with that.
I already engaged with that when I think undermining was something we're willing to take on, simply because in the absolute worst case where we have to antagonize religion and distance themselves from it, I think firstly negotiations on your side still don't necessarily get any sort of benefit when the concessions literally come at the cost of the gay identity. But even in our worst case where we have to antagonize and demonize religion, that's still a good thing because we offer a guaranteed safe space for individuals on the ground where they do not have to choose. The comparative you gave to us was that individuals have to choose an identity. I posit to you that the choice is still existent on your side when the religious communities and authorities still want to demonize your half identity. Why then then is the principal consistency of the movement necessarily key in this debate? And why is impact the most important thing over anything else we've heard in the opening half? I think firstly, change is a wash, because if OG wants to argue or government wants to argue that we need to get some sort of change, the only side that gives you that mechanism is CG, when we tell you that principal consistency is important, because otherwise allies will see you as hypocrites for cozying up to your oppressors, but also politicians and the very same authority that you want to cozy up to will see you as taking soft stances and not hard line, which means they're less likely to give you more bargaining chips at the table, which is why concessions are likely going to be against your favor. This means then on your side of the house, what you bet gets at best is negotiations. But why are safe spaces necessarily important? One, gay people seek solace in the LGBTQ movement because they literally have nowhere else to go in these societies. That's why principal consistency is key, because once you start negotiations with them on your side of the house, that's at the point in time in which they see as though they validate the ideas of the oppressors and they no longer feel safe in the very community that was built for them. This is an important analysis overtaking us for opening, because gay people literally have nowhere else to go in society, but the movement offers support structures as well. This was like mentors and friends and other safety nets that can actively help these people reconcile the identity, or at least understand what it's like to exist as a gay person in this society a lot better, but also the feeling of security of knowing that you are not alone and you have somewhere to go to that's not going to sell you out to your oppressors is in and of itself good on our side of the house. We're the only side that gives you this at a point in time in which actively distance ourselves from a religion, because if we continue to negotiate, that's still when we talk about the idea that these religious communities can reconcile, and that's when you risk the dual identity still happening. That's why you vote CG.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now call on the member of opposition.
Hi, am I visible as well as audible?
Yes, you're visible and audible.
Cool. Up your eyes through the call, please. Unmute and let me know, because I may not look in the chat. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, both opening houses are going back and forth on who can make better policies, better change, better reform, right? CO will be the first to tell you that without any acceptance first, you are unable to get any sort of change or reform that they so much seek, right? So but before I move on, a few direct rebuttals to member of GAF before me, right? So on the issue of how do they reconcile in general, right? So we tell that they don't need to reconcile the entire religious institution as a whole. They just need to safekeep and garner acceptance that they already have, and like garner more acceptance of the people, of the allies that they already need at the end of the day, right? Also on the issue of religious crackdown, I question in status quo that the crackdown is worse in our world comparative to theirs, right? Because in our world, more often than not, religions are communally based. Because of this, more often than not, they will cater to your needs and like cater to the needs of the LGBTQ community, even if it's not as much as the outside of government needs, right? But for example, like if I go to a progressive mosque, more often than not, they will accept me for being LGBTQ, even if they don't accommodate all of my like gay expressiveness to begin with. But in your world, all of these are locked out for me, because then I seek to antagonize the progressive mosque that I go to every single day. Let's go into my extensions, right? First of all, on the value of religion. So why is religion valued for these people, right? Because religious communities are inherent support structures for these people. You grow up with the people you go to mosque with. You go like mengaji with the people, and like these are the people you interact every single day with. These are your families, your friends, your long-term communities, right? Because of this, you already have like a long-term bond with them. More often than not, they're your first line of safety net. More often than not, you're financially dependent on them. And also like the sense of normalcy you get from your families, from your friends, is something that can keep you mentally stable and like comfortable for a very long period of time. So comparatively to the limited benefits of the LGBT community that side CG tries to bring to you, more often than not, like the LGBT community as a whole, it's less intersectional. So even if there is like a safe space that is going to accept you, it's going to be very difficult for you to access the safe space to begin with, because like if the LGBT community is like more Western oriented, it's very difficult for you to identify because you have such a religious background to begin with. But also like there's a lot of inherent problems within the safe spaces to begin with, right? There's the toxicity of like imposing certain doctrines that you may not necessarily agree with, and then being dictated as like a betrayer towards the community as a whole, right? But even if like these support structures are good, and even if like you have access to these support structures to begin with, we tell that today other people within your community maybe don't have the same access as you. And why is this harmful, right? Because you create a generalization of these support structures to begin with. So for example, if I'm like an expressively gay person, and then I use my friend as a support structure who is with I use my friend as a safety net who is a member of the LGBT community, I then subject her to my views as well, and I subject her to antagonization from her family and for the community as well. I may be able to handle it, but my friend may not, right? So now second issue on how many people like on how LGBTQ people may want to be religious as well, right? So I think opening half like majorly ignores the fact that it isn't an either or situation. Like there are religious people who are LGBTQ and vice versa, right? There are still a lot of people within the LGBT community who want to like stay religious. There are still people who find joy in reciting the Bible, the Quran, going to church, and people still want to get married like church, which is why you see a lot of pushbacks from the LGBT community in accessing these safe spaces, in accessing these religious spaces to begin with, right? So because of this, because of you like creating like abandoning religion and creating antagonization of the religious spaces that I so value and like these people value to begin with, you create a lockout. You lock out these people from the things that they value and from their communities at the end of the day. But before I move on, yeah, OG.
Why can't religious gays create their own religious space that which we've already like argued
cool.
is gay?
So there are religious spaces that are inherently there to begin with, but we tell you that this is not enough because the inherent support structures of religious communities like your family, your friends, your financial stability is something that like people in the West or like people online where or more often these spaces are, is like not inherently accessible to a lot of people. So yeah, moving on to my second extension, how we lose a lot of allies in the middle, right? So more often than not, there are a lot of people within like the gray area who like are okay with LGBTQ communities, but are also inherently religious as well. So these are the people that are more often than not your strongest allies or like your strongest mediators between these two communities, right? So because you actively like shit on them or like actively shit on their religion as well, then therefore you either tell them that their religion is false, or like then the other side tells you that if you side with this LGBTQ people, you're like straight from your religion, then that creates an internal conflict for these people on the ground, right? So because of this, now they have to choose to subscribe to a certain identity, and the identity they're more likely going to subscribe to or like fall back to is going to be religion, right? Because they have grown up to it, and because they have like the support structures that I've already mentioned to you before, they're more likely going to like fall back into religion and like just abandon the other identity of like being an LGBTQ ally in the first place. Because so therefore you lose more important allies on the ground, and therefore you lose like the center or like the mediator to the religious community at the end of the day, right? So because of this, you lose a lot of the acceptance within the community that you are very need for in order to gain the reform that both opening houses wanted to achieve at the end of the day, right? So any sort of reform that both OG, OO, and CG try to propagate to you is inaccessible at the end of the day, right? So back to the issue of like value of religion, right? So because you lock out a lot of these people from their religious communities and from the things they so value, you are unable, then therefore it's very difficult for you to reconcile anything in the near future, like side of OG like to propagate to you. Like, so if there are like good policies in place at the end of the day, you're very unlikely to like reconcile it in the near future because you already locked them out, and it's very difficult for you to like reconcile them back into the community at the end of the day, right? For all of the reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now call on the government whip.
Can you hear me and see me properly?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you.
Just give me a minute. Starting in 3, 2, 1. In conservative bubbles of religious stage, which is where OO and by extension CO wants to frame the debate in, because listen to their clearly derivative context, the LGBT movement is the only avenue to protect the pride and identity of their members, be it in public or in private Discord servers. At a point in which the very movement now makes concessions and bows to oppressors, trades off the very safety and the very identity of these gay individuals in order to gain some form of political palatability, in order to gain some form of palatability and acceptance, which they never proved, by the way, from religion. This is at a point in which opposition loses the trust and the support of the very people that they want to enact their unproven change for. I'm just going to do a few things in today's debate. First, talk about CO and by extension OO, because notice that CO is incredibly derivative of OO. There's not really much new material there. And then finally prove to you why we win over OG and why a lot of Shireen's materials still hold sway in the debate. So first, let's do CO. 3 things. First, they want to ride on OO's coattails by proving reconciliation and by extension change will happen when individuals of this dual identity who is now trapped will now be accepted into religions. Note that change is a wash on both sides. We on government doesn't really try and prove that we get any fundamental radical forms of change, but not on opposition, you don't get that either. If you want to characterize the state as this radical form of religious oppressivity, that if you come out and you contend with them, you undermine them, they will crush you under the burden of their giant ass hammer. We don't think on your side you're going to get any kind of fundamental change. When you come out and make concessions due to the immense power asymmetry, the state and the religious state will always have power over you. That means any change you have is tokenistic and limited at best, while you have to make a ton of concessions to that state in order to get them to compromise you at all. This looks like not being able to have public displays of gay affection. This looks like not having sexuality at all, which also leads to more closeted individuals on their side. They want to have acceptance, but they have no proof to me. Neither CO nor OO tries to prove why suddenly an gay individual who their community has now tried to reconcile the church, trying to reconcile their mosque, will suddenly be able to walk into Friday prayers and be accepted by everyone if they're gay. We don't see any linkage, any proof, or any contention. They just assert that, oh, if we have reconciliation, then we can have acceptance with no linkage at all. They ride on OO's coattails by saying, oh, because the religious institution hates atheists more, therefore they will cater to gay individuals who come to reconcile. But we don't think the religious organization has to pick and choose one or the other. We think if fundamentally they can both hate atheists and hate gay people at the same time. They don't need to pick which one they hate more. We think it's a wash on both sides. Secondly, they cannot accept LGBTQ safe spaces, which is what closing opposition tries to bring up, the only unique thing. Note, opposition is the one that these people stuck, because now you can't accept. If it's true that you can't accept LGBTQ safe spaces because you're deeply religious, now religious safe spaces are also not accessible to you because of oppression, because of stereotyping, because of religious dogma that tells individuals that Shireen has already proved, even if doctrine does not, even if doctrine is open to interpretation, because of the institution of religion, because of the complex of them saying that that gay individuals are bad, now you don't access any form of safe spaces. That means uniquely only CG allows you to pick and choose your religious safe spaces, your religious gay communities, which are only applicable under CG when you have this open. No, thank you, Salleh, sit down. CG provides you the only thing to do so. Finally, on religious safe spaces, no, Shireen has already given you clear extensions as to what this is. When you have nowhere else to go, the gay community provides you these support structures and provides you the security. Note the CG is also the only one in the debate that allows you to find similar like-minded people. If O wants to prove and CO wants to prove dual identity people who wants to reconcile the identity of being religious and being homosexual at the same time, only CG allows you to find like-minded individuals when we openly contend against the fact of religion, when we openly call out the problematic doctrine with religion. That's the only time in which you get these forms of safe spaces, because when you compromise with religion and when you make concessions, you have less likely people who want to open up because of the forms of concessions they have to give in to compromise to their identity. That means on CG, when we give you the right to express yourself, we give the right to make identity, then we have more dual identity people coming together and having safe spaces within themselves. On opposition, you just get people too scared to even come out because of the closet. Let's quickly talk about OO before I get to proving why we win our OG. So they like to accuse us of strawman a lot, but let's note their shaky case. First, note the shift in opposition. LO comes up, gives you 5 reasons why if you fight religion, if you undermine religion, they will brutalize you to no end and the backlash will be severe. Then when Taqi correctly says that this doesn't prove any forms of change and you're just saying why you're coming out is bad, DLO shifts the entire case in 1 minute by saying that religion is charitable enough to change. And don't you think religion can change? I am unsure to which characterization that opening opposition actually wants the debate to function on. Are you in a religious oppressive state in a conservative society that will crush any form of dissent, or are you a religion that is able to change? We don't see these kinds of things. And when I POI DLO, all they say is, oh, you're strawmanning your case. I think you need to do more than just saying we're a strawman, prove why this is the case. Secondly, if OO burden was organic change, we think it's fundamentally failed. The unstrategic characterization of religion means that any change you get is limited at best, tokenistic at best when the religion wants to already have an asymmetry of power and can condemn you severely. At best, you get limited change with a certain amount of concessions that compromise on the very identity, compromise on the very nature of the LGBT movement. And finally, I think dual identity was already taken by Shireen, but for sake of repetition's sake, they didn't even prove acceptance. So even if dual identity people are a problem, they are a wash on both sides. CG gives you a unique ability to find safe spaces. Before I go to why we win over OG, I'll pick closing if you have any.
Yeah, insofar as some people can access these safe spaces, what about the people who are then abandoned without any spaces?
Okay, that exclusively happens under opposition when you don't cater for dual identity in either way. You just said in your previous speech that they're not able to access safe spaces. So I don't know why you're trying to help us right now by saying they can access safe spaces, but the only world in which they are abandoned is opposition, where you don't allow them access to LGBT safe spaces, you don't allow them access to religious safe spaces, they're stuck in the middle. At least we give you unique access to religious LGBT safe spaces that can only occur when there's widespread acceptance and when there's widespread beneficial identity. So why are we being over OG? For three fundamental reasons. Number one, you have a unique argument on the principle of LGBT movement, why they have a principle to protect their people, why change is only secondary to the point at which they have to protect the identity of the people. Only CG proves to you why, when we don't make concessions, when we don't compromise with oppressors, we are uniquely able to protect these individuals, protect the most vulnerable when it comes to their identity, when it comes to guaranteeing them safe spaces from the oppression of the outside world. Secondly, we complete the incompatible argument of OG by telling you it's not the doctrine, but the institution of religion that pushes these kinds of oppression, that makes these people not. So even if doctrine is open to interpretation, the institution of religion fundamentally makes LGBT and religion incompatible. So you have to credit this argument to CG. But finally, we flagged out concessions as to compromising to the gay identity. That even if you get any form of fundamental change, we prove to you why OO and CO, regardless whatever the whip comes out and says, will never get any form of good concessions, because they are too busy compromising, they're too busy making concessions, which is why clearly OG wins the debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now call on the closing whip to summarize the entire debate.
Hello, am I audible? Okay, cool, sorry. Timer.
Yes, you're audible.
All right. I'll be starting my speech. Oh, wait, hang on. Pronouns he, him, POIs in the chat. If I don't take one by the 5th minute, feel free to unmute and interrupt me. I would prefer to take a POI from CG, but if CG doesn't have one, OD has one, then feel free to unmute. Anyways, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think that's just a very uncharitable characterization of what religion, reconciliation, acceptance, and crucially, what the undermining of religion means. Because crucially, Gov never exactly proves to you what specifically the counterfactual is. There's a lot of assumptions that if the LGBTQ is extremely polarized away from religion, hence and only hence can they provide like platforms or safe spaces for dual identities, and crucially just for specifically LGBTQ individuals. I'm unsure as to why that's true, and also specifically unsure as to why that cannot happen under our side, specifically when the LGBTQ movement is far more varied, far more wide-ranging, and far more accepting of LGBTQ people of different ideologies and different religions. Crucially, Shireen points out one extremely important thing in the speech. She tells you that a lot of religious people do not care about ideology, even though they are religious. So what does this mean? This means that people inherently are religious, hold religion to an important extent, but don't really know enough about religion. So what does this mean then? This means reconciliation is literally possible, at least for individuals on the ground, because insofar as you do not challenge the premise of their morals, the premise of their life, or challenge their capacity to access the afterlife, or say that the reason or their reasonings and the thing they worship is problematic and should be left in the past, that is when they're far more likely to accept you, especially when you attempt to reconcile with them. Because notably, this is the argument coming from Fatimah, when you attempt to reconcile yourself as individuals, because the LGBTQ movement is doing it as a whole, when you attempt to reconcile yourselves as individuals, for example, if I were to come out of the closet and tell my dad these things, even though he's extremely religious, this would be far more possible for me to do because I'm not challenging A, his premise, and B, because we already have interpersonal relationships. Notably, this is what the church looks like in status quo as well. All forms of religion, even though there are large institutions which represent the religion as a whole, and we aren't arguing for that change, which is what our opening opposition is specifically trying to argue for, the community-based religious groups, for example, local churches, are things that I can still subscribe to because A, we already have pre-existing relationships, so they're unlikely to be as antagonized against me anyways, but B, and far more importantly, I can be reconciled with them because I'm not challenging the very premise that our relationship is built on to begin with. Notably, this means I still have access to pre-existing safe spaces, which is far more important than the nuanced new types of safe spaces that OG tries to bring up in a POI and CG also tries to argue for, because these safe spaces are literally safe spaces that are new to me and do not provide to me as much net benefit as the relationships I've already pre-established, i.e. my familiar relationships, or like, I don't know, youth groups and religious groups and whatnot. So what does this mean? Fatimah tells you that specifically reconciliation does equate to acceptance, at least for people on the ground, i.e. to garner the traction that you need for reforms far in the future, you need to be able to convince the people on the ground that things like being an LGBTQ member is not polarized or is not like diametrically opposite to things like religion, because crucially, it's not. Notably, religion has already taken an extreme shift away from the ideas of facts in the Bible towards things like more along the lines of theology. And that is specifically what people, individuals on the ground know far more, i.e. I'm unlikely to be able to quote things from, I don't know, this Bible here, but I'm far more likely to be able to quote basic theology like love thy neighbor, which is also ironically the exact examples that most of the people in this debate were using. Because this means that I can quote specific forms of ideology and it's far more relatable for the LGBT community to be able to access. So second, why religion is important, notably insofar as you cancel the idea of religion away from people of the LGBT community and try to differentiate these things. This means a lot of people cannot access these religions for themselves. Religion is notably important, not only because of what OO says and it's a part of your inherent identity and you can't cancel that out, but crucially because religion forms a sense of self-fulfillment and a sense of, like, I don't know, or stability in today's world. Insofar as you lock this out from LGBTQ communities by virtue of just them being LGBTQ, that's really problematic as a movement, because this means a lot of people on the ground don't get access to the same self-fulfillment that religion provides to other people. But more importantly, religion has become such an important part of social structures that if you take it away from people on the ground, then they're unlikely to be able to survive to a like meaningful extent and have happiness. So anyways, but before that, CJ.
Note that even though your doctrine is something that you know, even though doctrine promoted by Imam is something that we've already said is the institution's base, why is it that the doctrine of love thy neighbor will then supersede the doctrine of stone the gays?
Yeah, because crucially, a lot of people aren't antagonized towards LGBTQ communities anyways. Like a lot of religious people, centrist people on the ground don't really care about things like this, because especially when you take into characterization the fact that they already have personal relationships, individual conversations like this are unlikely to be very antagonistic to begin with, because these people, A, already have personal relationships with them, and B, it's harder to shout and scream doctrines that people should die when you're doing it in front of their face. Rather, when you do it on a platform and convincing entire religions, entire groups, that's when you have a large more immunity to things like this, right? But anyways, let's talk about like the converse of what like opposition is trying to offer you, like i.e. what Gov is trying to offer you. Notably, Gov is trying to prove to you that religion needs to be specifically undermined. I have not heard a single piece of argumentation as to why this is true. Because what does undermining of religion look like? This looks like telling religious people that their thing is a thing of the past. That's really problematic, because this means you are antagonizing a larger, far more powerful community. I'm unsure as to how this leads to beneficial safe spaces that CG tries to argue for you, or the change that OG is trying to argue for you, and the capacity to prove your identity, because this means these safe spaces are minuscule and extremely inaccessible to begin with, because the point at which you try to wear a rainbow flag or rainbow colored shirt and say that you're LGBTQ in the community, you're likely to be spat on, because specifically you are going against the premises and the morals that people already have and already pre-existing towards you. Hence, the argumentation that Fatimah brings to you is the most important in today's debate, because it's the only argumentation specifically that proves to you that people on the ground are the ones who need change. My access to the community around me and the capacity for me to not be spat on by the community around me, by my family members, by people who I've already considered to be friends, but who have never known I'm gay. Insofar as I cannot get the access of being friends with them or being in meaningful relationships with them, I cannot get any other access from things like reconciliation and concessions towards the LGBTQ community, because those things are minuscule to begin with, insofar as the people around me specifically, like directly around me specifically, are harming me anyways. So I'm unsure as to how this reconciliation and concession argument is really important anyways. But also, I think it's just very uncharitable to just say that concessions will happen when you're religious, right? Or like when the LGBTQ community is trying to be religious. I'm unsure as to how exactly this specifically looks like. Why would the LGBTQ community trade off specific rights and say like, hey, because we're religious, or we're trying to like subscribe to religious people, I will go for gay conversion therapy. I'm just unsure as to why that's true. Like the concessions and reconciliation just looks like gay people saying that I can be religious and it's fine for me to be religious. It's like being gay or being part of the LGBTQ movement is something that's fine based off the religious premises, right? So anyways, thank you.